Back in early 1981, people were convinced that Fernando Valenzuela was destined for the Hall of Fame. The winning streak Valenzuela had at the beginning of his career caught all of North America by storm.
And Fernando trying to get him. 3-0 pitch to Mazzilli. Pops up on the first base side. Foul. Garvey has a play. He's there. He's got it. And he did it again. He did it again. Fernando Valenzuela on a 3-0 count. Mazzilli fouls out the first, and the Dodgers are all over him out there on the mound. 5 shutouts for Valenzuela. In the ninth for the Mets, they go 1, 2, 3, and he has done it again. So Valenzuela.
By May 15, 1981, Valenzuela was making headlines around the continent, including in this evening newspaper in St. John, New Brunswick. The reason? Fernando was 7-0 with 7 complete games and had a microscopic 0.50 ERA. But the thing is that Fernando is not in the Hall of Fame. In fact, just a couple of weeks ago, his latest chance to get in failed at the Contemporary Baseball Era Committee stage. Fernando had less than 5 votes from the 16 members of the committee, which means that he's going to have to wait until at least 2032 to be considered again. But why, and what happened to his once promising career? The thing is that Fernando mania was a phenomenon that really only lasted for the first half of the 1981 season. The Phillies handed Fernando his first loss on May 18th, winning decisively 4-0. Some in the press blamed his poor performance on a cold that he allegedly picked up. A few weeks later, though, Fernando had a far worse outing in Atlanta, and he started to look utterly human. So the thing about Fernando mania is that a good segment of the baseball population forgot how long the regular season is. They also clearly forgot how long a full career takes. And while it's clear that Valenzuela was a really good pitcher with a good screwball, he also had quite a few problems with his control. It was only in the summer of 1979 that a Los Angeles Dodgers scout discovered Valenzuela pitching for a minor league team in Mexico. There was a brief bidding war after it turned out that the New York Yankees had also been scouting Valenzuela, but the Dodgers managed to secure his services in the end. Valenzuela pitched well in the U.S. minor leagues in 1979, though he clearly had issues with his control. And early articles about Fernando talk about him having a smooth delivery and a devastating breaking pitch. It was somewhere around this point that the Dodgers decided that Valenzuela needed another pitch, and so they made the decision to have Bobby Castillo, an infielder who was turned pitcher, teach him how to throw the screwball. Bobby Castillo was a Los Angeles native and is one of those pitchers most people have completely forgotten about. In the later part of 1979, Castillo was establishing himself as a bona fide major league relief pitcher largely because of his screwball. When he had his control, Castillo's screwball was absolutely devastating.
Got it. A big out. Boy, a great screwball that time by Castillo.
And his best trait was his ability to make the fastball and the screwball look the same coming out of his arm. Unlike Fernando, however, Castillo didn't just have the stuff to be competitive in the major leagues in the long term. Now, he did have a good season in relief for the Dodgers in 1980, and he pitched fairly well as a starter for the Twins in 1982, but other than that, he was mostly ineffective. Castillo's biggest problem for his whole career was his control, which is kind of ironic since Fernando had the exact same issue. When Fernando was struggling, he would wind up walking guys, and he did have a big problem with wildness early on. That led him to giving up base hits, sometimes freak bloop hits like this one.
Hopper, short right center, lopes out, might drop. It does, base hit. Poole scores, Garner's going to go to third, and into second goes Scott.
But sometimes he would then hang his breaking stuff and would give up extra base hits like this.
Fair ball, he got it by the bag at third. Into that bullpen, Baker with a throw back to second, not in time.
So in other words, Fernando was a young pitcher and he was honestly still trying to figure a lot of stuff out. He was impressive for a couple of weeks, sure, but a season is more than just a couple weeks. You can see his jitters in Game 3 of the 1981 World Series, where Fernando kept missing high with the breaking stuff. Hitters like Rick Cerrone weren't exactly murderer's row, but they made Valenzuela look pretty bad. Interestingly, that World Series start was probably Fernando's worst start of the entire 1981 season. Valenzuela wound up pitching a complete game despite not having his good stuff, and he got the win, which shows you what that win statistic is really worth. And I think Vin Scully and Sparky Anderson really said it best on CBS Radio.
Valenzuela comes back 3-2, and it's inside. He has walked Randolph 3 times. You know, Vinny, he has not had command of his breaking ball at all tonight, and that's the thing that before 3-2, 2-2, he could get that breaking ball over, and he's just not getting it over. Here comes Tommy now. Lasorda might have had enough. We'll see, because Mumphrey is a switch hitter, then Winfield. But this is the poorest game in quite a while for Fernando, and certainly one of his 3 poorest efforts of the entire season. He has walked a half a dozen in 5 innings. That equals his high of a half a dozen, but it took him 8 innings to do that.
Now, this isn't to say that Valenzuela had really bad stuff back in 1981. Actually, he was a good pitcher. He absolutely deserved to be up at the major league level. But the thing is that he was still a kid. He was like 20 years old. You've got to believe that Fernando mania really was getting to his head. Probably the biggest sign of the mania was early in 1981 when a female fan ran out onto the field to kiss him. In hindsight, you really can't blame him for getting a little caught up in the moment. But the problem is that the 20-year-old pitcher really needed to focus on his development, not just his stardom. And the other problem is that Fernando was being worked to death. I mean, winning the Rookie of the Year award and the Cy Young award in his first full season was impressive, absolutely. But Fernando quickly turned into a workhorse. This was the guy who would pitch for the complete game every single time he went out there. And that led to arm problems that really had a bad impact on his career. The further away from 1981 you get, the more you see Valenzuela struggle. The Dodgers came down to the final day of the season in 1982, needing a win to tie the Atlanta Braves for first place in the division. Valenzuela was starting, and he did have his good stuff that day.
Boy, what a move he gave Morgan while striking out Clark.
But he still had that bad habit of hanging his breaking stuff.
And that's going to be just fair, down the line and in the corner. Evans is on his way to third on a double by Leonard, and the tying runs are out there.
And his control was still an issue.
Ball 4.
Fernando struck out 9 that afternoon, but he walked 5, lasted only 6 innings, and the Giants came back to win and ended the Dodgers season. Now, the unfortunate thing is that Fernando had a habit of struggling during the most important games. You can always tell that he has a rough start because of the high number of walks that he would give up. Game 2 of the 1983 National League Championship Series is another good example. Fernando might have had his good stuff that day, but he also made early mistakes like this. In particular, Fernando kept missing high with his breaking ball that night, a common problem when he struggled. Fernando did get the win that night, sure, but it was a rough outing, and he had already fallen from the heights that he had known only 2 seasons earlier. You see, that's really the biggest issue with Fernando's Hall of Fame candidacy, and is likely the thing that will continue to keep him out. Even when Valenzuela was a dominant pitcher from 1981 through 1986, he frequently had poor outings, especially in the really big games. The most famous poor Fernando outing was almost certainly Game 5 of the 1985 NLCS, which is a game that the Dodgers really had to win. Fernando started things off really poorly, walking Willie McGee right from the beginning. He then walked Ozzie Smith on 4 straight pitches.
Willie McGee at first, nobody out, no score, and he's missing by plenty.
And after throwing a ball to Tom Herr, his dipping screwball was rocked for a double that scored 2.
Ground ball down the line. Here comes McGee. They're going to hold Ozzie, and he ran right through the stop sign and scored.
Valenzuela walked 8 that game, an awful outing even if he was able to keep it close.
And he has walked his 8 now.
Based on balls in the 7th, 8th, and 9th inning, usually really comes home to haunt. He walked the first 2 to start it off. That's where the 2 runs came.
And the high pitch count meant that he wasn't in there in the end to finish it out.
In direct contrast, for instance, to Jerry Royce.
Now, of course, this was the game Ozzie Smith won on that dramatic home run in the bottom of the ninth inning, the game that changed the whole complexion of the series. But you'd have to wonder how things might have been different if Fernando had his good control. And the thing is, you've got to wonder two things about Valenzuela's development as a pitcher. So the first thing is whether he would have developed better control if he hadn't been the Dodgers' ace right away. The second is whether he could have been effective for longer if he hadn't been expected to pitch so many complete games. At some point in time, you've got to wonder whether Tom Lasorda was really focused on Valenzuela's long-term development as a pitcher. By the end of the 1986 season, Valenzuela had amassed over 1,500 innings pitched. Sure, the 1,200 strikeouts were good, and they were an indication of just how important he was to the staff. But the 540 walks really were a problem, and he wasn't really given any time to actually work on his control issues. And this was pretty crazy stuff for a kid who was still only just 26 years old. So Valenzuela was really a win big, lose big type of pitcher in those days. In fact, that's a lot like a lot of the pitchers that we see nowadays. The focus for him was on his velocity and on the amount of spin he could get on those breaking pitches, especially the screwball. Now, he could be overpowering, sure, but the truth is that he was still more of a thrower than he was an actual pitcher, at least if you think in the terms of the old-fashioned baseball coach. And I really believe that that was Fernando's undoing in the end. Fernando's final All-Star game came in 1986, where he performed a Carl Hubble feat. Fernando came into the game in the top of the fourth and struck out Don Mattingly and Cal Ripken Jr. He then struck out Jesse Barfield looking.
Extra bases. These guys can throw, they can get to the ball, and can hit with power.
And he has struck out the side. Fernando sets him down at the end of 3.5.
He then struck out Lou Whitaker, also looking.
Steve Sachs, representing the Dodgers in the All-Star game. In there, strike three, and so Valenzuela.
So, for some bizarre reason, the American League decided to let pitcher Teddy Higuera hit for himself, giving us an all-Mexican matchup. Higuera was strikeout victim number 5 in a row.
Was that great a thing?
Well, Higuera's made a little history, thanks to Valenzuela.
Nobody realized it at the time, but this was really the last major highlight of Fernando's career.
Obviously, the pressure doesn't bother him, nor does the American.
All that work, all those innings, and all that pressure wound up catching up with Fernando. Valenzuela never made it back to the All-Star game, and even his 20 wins in 1986, which was the only 20-win season in his career, were not enough for the Dodgers as they couldn't catch up with Houston. Valenzuela had another long season in 1987, going 14-14 and over 250 innings pitched. On July 30th, 1988, all of those innings finally caught up with Fernando. Fernando had not exactly been pitching well that season, though he was still working as a big innings eater. Valenzuela had arm trouble during that game, but decided to try to pitch his way through it, giving up a game-tying home run to weak-hitting Alex Trevino. The injury snapped Valenzuela's streak of pitching 255 consecutive scheduled starts, and you have to remember that he wasn't even close to 30 years old yet. And the doctor told him that his career would end if he kept straining that pitching arm. And that was the end of the 1988 season for Valenzuela. So Fernando Valenzuela did not pitch in that dramatic National League Championship Series against the Mets. And the spotlight in the World Series was taken over by a different young Dodger pitcher, a kid named Orel Hershiser. Fernando did come back, but he was really never the same pitcher again. Valenzuela went 10-13 in 1989, walking almost as many batters as he struck out. He kept on eating up innings in 1990, though his ERA started to soar. And by this time, the legend of Valenzuela had really faded away. Fernando did manage to throw a no-hitter against the Cardinals in late June 1990. And Fernando looked for a few minutes like the Valenzuela of old, though this was honestly a bad call.
He's 2 outs away from the no-hitter, and Coleman doesn't like it.
This was a really emotional moment for a pitcher who had really fallen from grace.
They turn 2. There's the no-hitter. There's the no-hitter.
But that didn't last long. In fact, in early 1991, before the season began, the unthinkable happened. Fernando, who was only 30 years old at the time, was released by the Dodgers. So this is kind of confusing. Valenzuela, who was a free agent, accepted an arbitration contract for 1 season with the Dodgers. But then in late March, the Dodgers decided that they had no room for Fernando in the starting rotation and he was placed on waivers. The stats really told the tale, almost 2,400 innings pitched to the major league level before Fernando had turned 30. and you can see that his ERA had been steadily rising. Still, this was shocking to anybody who remembered the early 1980s and the big years of Fernando Mania. Now, Valenzuela was picked up by the Angels in 1991, but he only pitched a little over 6 innings that entire year. He made his way back to Mexico for 1992, but in 93 he somehow convinced the Baltimore Orioles to give him another chance. And this is where his career gets a little bit ugly. While he certainly looked like the Fernando of old, Valenzuela was no longer the pitcher he had once been. Valenzuela got a lot of his pitches up that season and struggled mightily.
Hits this one hard. Gapper, left side. Not going to touch it. It's going to get through to the wall. Alomar steaming into second base.
And unfortunately for Fernando, he was really never able to get the good stuff back.
Deep right field. Back goes McLemore. Jumping, and it's gone. Home run, John Olerud.
Late in his career, Fernando wound up bouncing from team to team. And the kid who had looked lights out early in his career looked like a below-average pitcher by the end. So that's what you've got to keep in mind when you're thinking Fernando and Cooperstown. Now, if you limit his career to his first 6 seasons, he's kind of got a shot, though it's an outside shot. However, after that 20-win season in 1986, he really was never a dominant pitcher. But on the other hand, he's not the only potential Hall of Fame pitcher with this kind of career arc. As you certainly know, Dizzy Dean was the epitome of pitchers with a great peak and no longevity. Old Diz had an all-time great season in 1934 and was an absolute workhorse in the mid-1930s. But despite what some pundits will tell you about velocity in the 1930s, the truth is that you couldn't pitch fast stuff for over 300 innings a season the way that Dizzy Dean did and expect to have a really long career. By 1937, Dizzy Dean's arm problems were well known, and the old fastball artist had to rely on other strategies to keep his pitching job. Dean pitched the Cubs to the World Series in 1938, but he was far from the pitcher he once was. But when you look closely at Dean's short career, you will notice that his peak really was amazingly high. He was the stuff of legend for about 7 years or so. Valenzuela's peak was impressive, but it was nothing like Dean's, and that's why Dizzy is in the Hall of Fame and Valenzuela isn't. Now, the other pitcher that always comes up in these discussions is another Dodger great. This would be Sandy Koufax. Koufax was kind of similar to Valenzuela early in his career, except that Sandy struggled a lot more with walks, and he didn't really start gobbling up innings until a little bit later on in his career. Koufax is the favorite what about argument for those trying to make a Hall of Fame case for marginal pitchers. But what we tend to forget is that Koufax at his peak was a better pitcher than any other left-handed pitcher in the history of the game. Sandy's late career stats speak for themselves, and notice that he ended his career on a high point right after a 27-9 season with a minuscule 1.73 ERA. Now, some critics do note that Koufax was a much better pitcher in Dodger Stadium than on the road, which is true. But then again, these road pitching stats aren't exactly awful, and remember that this is for his entire career, not just his peak. Interestingly, Valenzuela did not quite take advantage of the favorable conditions at Dodger Stadium the way that Koufax did. He looks the same at home as he does on the road. But the truth is that Valenzuela was never at the Koufax level, not even in 1981. Now, I suppose you could argue that he was pitching on that level for his first 7 or 8 major league starts. But seriously, who sticks a guy in the Hall of Fame because of a couple of good weeks? That's the problem with articles like this one that make the case for Valenzuela to be inducted into the Hall. The biggest argument in favor of his candidacy is how he pitched in an 8-game stretch in 1981, which honestly is a really weak argument. And the favorite comparisons for Valenzuela are 2 controversial Hall of Fame pitchers, Jack Morris, who is in there mostly because of a single postseason game, and Catfish Hunter, who is there mostly because of his reputation. So this is where we're getting to that Hall of Very Good territory, and the stats simply don't make the argument for Fernando. I would argue that the best chance you have is the Fernando Mania phenomenon, but the problem with that is even Fernando Mania didn't last as long as you would think. It's true that Valenzuela did a lot of good for the game among the Mexican-American community. In fact, it helped finally resolve tensions that had brewed between the former inhabitants of Chavez Ravine and the Dodgers after the Dodgers had them forcibly evicted to make room for the stadium in the late 1950s. The measure to give the Dodgers control over the land that is now Dodger Stadium was extremely unpopular, though most people have forgotten about the controversy as the years have gone by. And if you read the old newspapers carefully, you will see that Walter O'Malley was using a familiar trick. He threatened to move the team to a different city if he didn't get what he wanted, come hell or high water. As much fun as it is to have a major stadium for a baseball team, it really hits differently when you realize that people were forcibly displaced to have it built. And then Fernando came along, but we need to wait for a minute. I mean, are we really going to put him into the Hall of Fame because he wasn't a jerk, or because he passed away in 2024, or because he helped to clean up Walter O'Malley's mess? You could argue that Valenzuela's presence as a starting pitcher helped attendance increase, sure. But the idea that a starting pitcher on his own actually impacts attendance was debunked decades ago by Bill James. And it's not like Fernando's presence alone helped the Dodgers draw a big crowd. Actually, the team was capable of drawing over 3 million a season before he came along. Now, the biggest issue I've got with this line of thinking is that it's just another variation of that argument that he was really good for 8 starts, so let's put him in. Now, we focus a lot of attention on those good Fernando starts, sure, but then we ignore all of the times that he struggled. We ignore the fact that Tommy Lasorda obviously overused him, and we ignore that long, protracted, and really ugly attempt at a comeback that came at the end of Fernando's career. Now, when you're talking about the Hall of Fame, you really have to look at the entire career, not just at the first half of the famous strike season. And when you look at his entire career, Fernando just doesn't quite pass muster. Fernando Mania was an amazing phenomenon, of course. And chances are that Fernando's Topps rookie card will always be worth big money. But as sad as it is to say this, Valenzuela just doesn't have the career stats to make it into the Hall of Fame. And that's the reason I'm convinced that he will never make it. Now, I'll put it this way, it could be worse. I mean, Fernando was never really accused of steroid usage or any similar shenanigans. He definitely was a good guy for the sport, a great ambassador for the sport for people from Mexico and for Mexican Americans. But he just does not have the numbers to be a Hall of Famer. Now, I do think that he had great stuff when he was young, and I think that he might have been a Hall of Famer if the Dodgers had given him room to, work some things out and to develop his control and to develop at a more natural pace. Unfortunately, they turned him into an innings eater right from the start of his career, and those innings really caught up with him a lot faster than anybody thought.